So good afternoon and welcome to CSU's first palm oil discussion panel. This was put on by the Palm Oil Committee and was organized to basically educate our campus about palm oil, which is basically a cash crop that is grown in humid environments, tropical systems like Southeast Asia, Brazil, basically anywhere that you find a tropical rainforest. And there's a lot of problems surrounding not the crop, but just the industry that's surrounding it. The way that this crop is grown is that there's a lot of deforestation that occurs with this. Like 300 football fields a day of rainforests are just slash and burn for this to make room for this crop and to grow this crop. And so a lot of the native wildlife is being displaced out of their habitats. There's a lot of slavery and child labor that goes into this crop, into the production of it and everything. So just a lot of issues, just ecologically, human rights. So what the Palm Oil Committee is really trying to do is just to spread the awareness and just kind of educate everybody on the issue.
I'm the president and founder of Plantations, and I'm also a postdoc here in fish, wildlife, and conservation biology. And first, a kind of disclaimer, I don't actually work on palm oil, or my work doesn't involve palm oil, and my system doesn't have palm oil in it. But I study elephants, and there are populations of elephants that are affected by palm oil. And so what I'm going to be showing you today is based on some, my brief encounters and travel in that part of the world, and talking with, what I've gathered from talking with colleagues who do interact with this industry, and also my readings from the literature. So I want to give you the perspective from a biodiversity standpoint, and on the effect of palm oil on wildlife and biodiversity. So the first slide up here, I just have a couple of pictures to share with you. This is what a plantation looks like from the ground. So it's pretty green looking, right? And it's kind of doesn't really hurt your eyes. It's very nice and shady and friendly looking environment. And it's just a bunch of palm trees. So what's the big harm in that, right? Now, first of all, as Rachel mentioned, palm oil is a ubiquitous ingredient, right? And so these plantations actually cover a substantial acreage where they are. And where they are is primarily in Southeast Asia. And within Southeast Asia, they're primarily concentrated in Indonesia and Malaysia. So this map shows you the areas where you have the highest number of palm oil plantations, and the redder it is, the higher the number. And so you can see that it's pretty high in Southeast Asia, and these are at the country level, so there's finer scale patterns there, but these are just at the coarse country level. And then you see that there's some towards like East Africa. And palm oil, actually, the plant comes from East Africa. From West Africa, not East Africa. It comes from West Africa, and the western central parts of Africa are actually forested, right? So they're moist and humid climates. And that climate is really comparable to what you have in Southeast Asia. And right now, at least, about 80 to 90%, like I said, comes from Malaysia and Indonesia. So those are, there's peninsular Malaysia, and then there's also the island of Borneo, which is split between Malaysia and Indonesia. And then there's the island of Sumatra, which is part of Indonesia. And what's special about this whole ecoregion, is that it's incredibly biodiverse, or it was. So how many of you guys know about the Galapagos? Okay, that's not in Southeast Asia. But you know about the Galapagos because it was made famous because Darwin went there, and he had his ideas about evolution by observing the animals on the Galapagos Islands, which are an archipelago, right? And the Malaysian archipelago actually inspired a contemporary of Darwin named Alfred Russel Wallace. How many people have heard of Wallace, right? So these islands, there's actually there's Wallacea, which is named after Wallace, and they're incredibly biodiverse, and they have species that are not really found anywhere else on the planet, and lots of endemics. So when you have industry that is replacing really biodiverse forests, that's the primary issue with palm oil. And so what is the impact of palm oil? So this is just a map of Indonesia from a paper that came out in last November. And that paper looked at change in forest cover all over the world in the last decade or so, from 2000 to 2012. And what they found is that the highest rates of deforestation, there are some hot spots, like there's some going on in Russia and elsewhere, but globally, in Southeast Asia, it's one of the hot spots of deforestation. And this is just in Indonesia, and the areas that are in green are the forest areas. There's different levels of forestation. The areas in red are forest loss. The areas in blue are forest gain. And the areas in purple are loss and gain. Okay, loss and gain in the space of 12 years, what could that be, right? So that means you lost primary forest, but then it got replaced with something, right? And then when you look at records of where plantations are, in the early days, that people kind of the companies denied that there was deforestation going on at all. But then gradually there was an admission, yes, there is deforestation. And data like that really shows you that a lot of the plantations that have come up, the newer ones, have replaced native forest. So some of the numbers between 1990 and 2005, more than half of the plantations seem to have replaced primary forest. And then in the years since then, this is in the last 10 years, like I said, a lot of, in Indonesia, there's been a huge replacement of forest with plantations. Now, if you compare that to some other parts of the world that you hear about a lot, you hear about deforestation in the Amazon, you hear about the Amazon rainforest. If you look at the trends, with changes in sort of policy in the Amazon, for example, there has been a decline in the deforestation rate, right? Over the same period of time, there has been an increase in Indonesia and in other parts of Southeast Asia. And that increase counterbalances the decrease of deforestation in the Amazon. So these rates are in opposition. And that's alarming, right? So what's the impact on biodiversity? In the early days, in the early days being, say, this is, plantations have been around for a long time, but let's say the past 10 years, people realized that, we actually need to go out and assess what the impact is on biodiversity. It hadn't been looked at very much. There had been a lot of, papers written on things like, biofuel and economics and various things, but not really looking at the biodiversity. And the studies, these are just a couple of them. The studies that actually went out and looked. Well, first of all, if you're losing primary forest, the trees are gone, right? The plant life, that's completely changed. But what's the impact on animal life, wildlife, for example? So if you look at birds or insects, and in some of these specific studies, they looked at birds and butterflies, for example. It depends on what you're looking at. So. And it also depends on what was there before. So like if the plantation replaced, for example, something that was already a plantation, like a rubber plantation, the impact is less severe than if it replaced, like, say, a forest, right, a primary forest. So if it replaced a forest, you see a decline in bird species, like 77%. If this was a semi-log forest, which meant that it had been selectively logged, it had been logged at some point, we saw a decrease of about 73%. So those semi-log forests are not as great as the primary forest, but they still have a lot of biodiversity. If you look at butterflies, it's something like 89%. So depending on what taxonomic group you're looking at, the impact differs. And it also differs based on what was there before. And it also is affected by, for example, the amount of forest, the area that's surrounding the plantation. So the more contiguous forest you have around the plantation, of course, the more species you can find in the plantation. But if you have little isolated fragments of forest surrounded by plantation, they're not that biodiverse. Now, there's some potential for those little fragments to be useful because they can still be refuges for animals. And then there's this whole idea of stepping stones. They can serve as stepping stones between large forest patches. And oil farm plantations themselves could serve as stepping stones because they're not entirely barren, right? So if an animal can move through a matrix that consists of oil palm, then maybe it can reach another big forest patch. So, so people have been looking into, whether, for instance, oil palm plantations could be made wildlife friendly. Can people, sort of encourage there to be more diversity by doing things in the plantations themselves? And the last study over there sort of says, well, yeah, you can try, but it makes a marginal difference. So instead of losing 77% of the birds, you lose maybe 60% of the birds. So that's like a 10% difference. So the consensus seems to be that yes, oil palm plantations are not that great for biodiversity, and they're not really even they're not even as good as rubber plantations or other kinds of plantations that you could have. So the best would be to try to minimize the deforestation in the first place. And so again, we come back to this issue of the primary challenge is when new plantations replace forest. And the reason for the loss of biodiversity, again, when you look at the plantations and what they look like, they're pretty uniform, right? They're all one kind of species of tree, and there are some, there are epiphytes, there are orchids, and there are things that grow on the tree, kind of mossy-looking ferns. But structurally, it's quite simple. They're all one height. There isn't, much of an understory. Compare that to this, which is structurally pretty complex, right? There's dead wood, there's open space, there's closed canopy, and trees of different heights, different ages. And this is actually a semi-log forest. So this is a selectively log forest, not even a primary forest. But there's a huge difference, right? And a primary forest looks like that. And some of those trees are really old. And of course, there are tons of tree species there. And if you just take one tree, it in itself is a whole little micro ecosystem, right? It has a lot of things growing on it, a lot of things living on it. So those are the differences between the different kinds of green that you see. And the other challenge is that, for example, with this idea of stepping stones and animals dispersed through the matrix, is that maybe in some places the plantations are friendly to the wildlife, but then there's quite a mix, and they're not only just these big plantations, but also little like private parcels where individuals decide to grow palm oil because it's pretty lucrative. So you can get a pretty good return, and so maybe there are individuals or companies, it's not like clear who's responsible, that are not so friendly toward wildlife. And in this case, for example, with elephants can knock down trees. They eat the pulp from the inside of palm trees. They really like that. So as they pass through, they might be seen as pests. And while it hasn't been conclusively found who's responsible for these events, so these slides, for anyone who can't see, these are two events instances in which elephants were poisoned, once in Borneo, once in Sumatra, and it's not really clear if this is a trend. If it's a trend, then it's really worrying because these animals are already really critically endangered. There's just a few thousand of them, maybe, which means that there's just a couple of hundred that are able to actually breed, that are of breeding age. So every animal that's lost is a huge loss to the whole population. So those are the worries with the industry and its effect on wildlife. On the one hand, yeah, you can try to be friendly, but on the other hand, there are these sorts of trends. And so when you think about, I work on elephants, I said, when you think about the impact of these industries, it's more than a one species phenomenon, right? So it's more than an impact on elephants. It affects orangutans, it affects tigers, because we're talking about whole ecosystems. And that's really, a large scale impact. It's not a species by species thing. And contrast this, for example, with elephants, contrast this with, like, say, ivory, right? Ivory is a one species topic, or a rhino horn, or poaching for rhino horn. This affects, every species in that ecosystem. And the other contrast is that, you may not buy ivory, right? And so you as Western consumers may not feel very responsible. But palm oil, as Rachel mentioned, and we might hear more about, is in a lot of different products. So I guarantee you all of us are using it, right? It's in the food that you eat, it's in additives and whatever, it's in the products that you buy, like for cosmetics, creams, shampoos, lotions, and all that stuff. So if you go look on your grocery, and it's not always marked, right? So if you look at food, you have the ingredient label. But if there's some chemical that's extracted from oil palm and it's in your shampoo, you don't necessarily know. So it's really in everything. And the biggest consumers are actually India and China. But when you consider that, they're really populous and they're also, producing goods that are then probably consumed by other countries, then we're all sharing in this product. So palm oil is really pervasive. It's probably not going to go away. It's never going to be the case that we're never going to, we're not going to ban palm oil. So the direction that it's moving, and probably some of the more policy-oriented speakers will talk about this, the direction it's moving is to really limit and minimize new plantations, because like I said, palm oil is in Southeast Asia, it's in Malaysia and Indonesia, but there are other parts of the world that are suitable for palm oil. And it's so lucrative, right? There's so much demand for it and you get such a good return from it that the other rainforests elsewhere in the world are also under threat. So there are already plantations springing up in other places, and Malaysian companies going to other countries and starting up new operations. So that's where the regulation and the policy need to really step in. So some of the big companies, for example, are signing on to this zero deforestation, which commits them to say that we're not going to have any new plantations. We're not going to deforest new tracts of land. So that's the direction that this needs to go.